Hey everybody, and welcome to the next episode of New Breakpoint. My name's Simon Waite from Microsoft Australia, and welcome to today's episode. Today we're going to have a really great session on how to build resilient apps using Azure SQL Database. As always, if you'd like to join in, make sure that you tweet at us on Twitter at Microsoft AU Dev, or that you join us on our YouTube channel and use the live chat, which you'll find on the side of the video to add your questions, which our speakers can get to later. If you like what you see with the video or through the playlist that you may be viewing, make sure to sign up for our monthly developer newsletter. Only comes to your inbox once a month, curated content, super interesting for developers, not just on our platform and our stack, but across the whole ecosystem. And then finally, if you do want to collaborate as part of our community, make sure that you do take a look at our code of conduct and ensure that you understand how you can contribute appropriately as part of our community. All right, today's topic, really interesting one. And we have a first. We've got our first ever product group team member joining us today. So we've got Mohamed from the Azure SQL Database team, who's based here in Sydney, and who's been on the journey to actually join the Azure SQL team over time. So I've known Mo for a number of years, and really happy to see where he's got to. And I know he really enjoys the role that he has. Along with Mohamed, we have a couple of our cloud solution architecture team here in Australia that have been working with the Azure SQL Database team to help build out the resources that they're going to talk about today, which is about understanding how to build resilient data stores to help boost the availability of your applications when you move them into Azure. So without further ado, let me get Mohamed on to the stream. Hey, Mohamed, good morning.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on the show.
No problems. And we're going to just quickly bring on Adnan and Junchi so that we can do a quick intro with those two folks as well. Hey, Adnan. Hey, Junchi. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Simon.
Hey, Simon. Thanks for having us.
No problems. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop off the stream and Mo, over to you to do a quick intro, and then I'll be back a little bit later to help wrap up the show. Looking forward to this one. It should be great.
Thank you, Simon. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining in. My name is Mohamed Kabirudddin. I'm a senior program manager in the Azure SQL team. As Simon mentioned, I'm based here in Sydney, Australia. And today I'm joined by two of my awesome colleagues, Adnan and Junchi, who are going to support me in this demonstration today. So what we're going to talk about here is, and this is often a common question that we get from our customers on, how do we build resilient applications, and more importantly, how does the data platform handle resiliency and availability? So we want to dive into Azure SQL Database resiliency and availability a little bit to show you what's possible in terms of designing and architecting your applications to make sure that you're able to deliver your business SLAs and the resiliency that you need to deliver your business outcomes. So what we thought about in this session is to divide the session into sort of two scenarios. And if you think about an organization, the common questions again that we get is, on one, what happens when there's a failure in any of the layers in the stack, whether it's application, databases, how does the application deal with it? And secondly, what happens in the cloud world where you're spread across multiple regions? What if there's a failure in a particular region? How do you deal with resiliency in that space? So we're going to split the discussion into two parts. Adnan, who's been working closely with customers on dealing with resiliency and failovers, will talk about how do you handle zone redundant availability, which is the first scenario we'll be focusing on. Now, what you have on the screen is basically an architectural blueprint of how Azure SQL Database thinks about zonal availability. So what you've got here that you can see on my screen, I'm going to highlight my laser pointer to bring into focus here, is for any of the business critical databases that you spin on Azure SQL, we provide you with 4 copies of the database. You've got a single primary replica that provides you with read and write access. And we also provide you with 3 secondary replicas that are deployed in 3 availability zones if you choose to deploy that in a zonal availability model. Now, when there's a failure, or if you as a customer want to test a failover operation, you could fail over a particular primary replica to a secondary node that's already available. So consider these as hot standbys that are waiting for a failover operation and are ready to go as soon as it happens. Now, the beauty of having a business critical database is also that one of these secondary replicas is a read replica, which means you can connect your applications to have read-write workloads from the secondary replicas, thereby not impacting the primary replica's workload. So that's the first scenario we'll talk about, and Adnan will show you a demo on what happens when a failover occurs, whether it's automatic or manually initiated for your testing purposes. And this is great where you as a customer can go and do a disaster recovery test to fail over and see what happens. And Adnan's going to show a demo of that. Now, we'd consider this particular scenario for transient type issues where failover happens or an issue happens and the database is recovered or failed over in a fraction of a second, and essentially your application does not necessarily see an impact. But for those who think that you need to go one step beyond and still build in resiliency in your applications, we'd highly encourage you have some sort of retry logic built into your application so that the application can deal with it. Now, the second scenario that we're going to talk about today, and Junchi is going to go into more details on a demo, he's got a fantastic demo lined up for us, is what happens when a particular region in the cloud world or in Azure has an issue. How do you then deal with availability, and how do you make your applications resilient to that? So the answer to that is in Azure SQL Database, we have a concept of failover groups where you can create a failover group that spans across two regions. And when you have those two regions connected by a failover group, you can have databases added to a failover group. And when an issue happens or if a particular region goes down, you could fail over that entire group to another region. And again, this is instantaneous because both the primary and the secondary regions are available, but you will only access the secondary when the primary goes down. So just keep in mind that secondary is always going to be available for you as when the primary fails. Now, an interesting aspect here and an advantage of doing a failover group is that you have listener endpoints. So you don't have to necessarily point your applications to specific databases or specific regions, but you'll get this generic read-write listener and a read listener, which will connect automatically to primary or secondary depending on availability. So when a failover happens, the read-write listener will automatically redirect its connections to the secondary database, and your application does not even have to deal with connection string changes. So that's how you build in resiliency in your applications to deal with failovers in a failover group setting across regions. But an interesting use case of this over time is also to move and consolidate resources across regions. Let's say your organization has expanded its branches across multiple regions, and now you're thinking of consolidating some of the databases in a particular region, or you want to migrate them. You could also use failover groups to migrate databases from one region to another. And again, that's a very seamless operation because you have both your primary and secondary up and running. And all you need to do to migrate is just do a failover operation. So again, Junchi will cover the failover demo in a bit. And I just thought I'll wrap up the introduction, and without any further ado, pass it on to Adnan, who would jump into the demo. Adnan, all yours.
Thanks, Mo. So as Mo explained, that high availability is like built into your SQL databases, but there may be cases with just like with any other cloud services, there may be like transient infrastructure issues. But SQL database actually handles all those transient issues transparently to you and automatically. But there may be instances where these issues are impacting the connectivity for your applications. And you may want to basically test the impact of these automatic failover events initiated automatically, either planned or unplanned, to your application before you deploy them. So for this demo, I'm going to walk through a typical customer case where they have like a 3-tier architecture application, like web, app, and data. And their data serving tier is based on a business critical tier, which is with zone redundancy, which Mo showed you. And they wanted to basically test the impact of these automatic failover operations to their application. So the steps that you would take to test the application fault resiliency will be starting with simulating your read and write workloads on the SQL DB. For the demo, I will be using something called OStress. OStress is part of our RML package, and it's basically used to generate like stress or workload on your SQL database. And it's very useful if you are sorting any sort of performance issues as well. Once the OStress is running, you will see successful execution of the SQL. And then what I will do is I will use one of the provided API and PowerShell scripts to trigger a manual failover. Just remember, when you are triggering even a manual failover, there will be a switch between the old and new primary, and your availability zone will change. Post that, you will see that connection will be lost as I have initiated failover, and within a couple of seconds, the application will be back and execution will proceed again. Without further ado, I will just go and now open the demo. So as you can see here, what I have done is I have set up already got a SQL database. It's a business critical tier. And it's just like and it's zone redundant as well. So I will go here, and as I mentioned before, OStress, I will be using OStress, and OStress is very useful to generate a workload application. And I do like these two things. You can basically simulate the number of connections, processing each of your queries, so you can have parallel connections simultaneously hitting your box, and you can define the number of iterations. For simplicity, I will just be using a very simple select statement, and I'm just executing, like, let's say 10,000 runs, and I'm keeping parallel connections to 1. Now you can see that as executed it, the OStress is successfully queuing that to the database. Now I will invoke a failover. Oh, sorry. Apologies for that. Probably I will change the tier or something like that. Apologies for this.
I'm going to hop in here just quickly and say, you want live demos? You've got live demos, folks. So don't stress about it, Adnan. It's all good, mate.
So if you see that there was a failure, a transient failure happened, and after some second, it just resumed. You can go after that, you can go into the health report, and as I initiated manually a failover, you will see that even happening in a health. It takes about 15 minutes for this to appear in the report. And you can see here from one of the last failures I invoked previously for the application, you can see that it will give you a status. There was a resource health event that was unplanned. And if you see here is like average is just 2 seconds. Even if you look in the log analytics after that, you will basically see that there was a customer initiated failover. So that's how you can basically just check, like, and you can see how quickly that all switch took place. The thing that you need to take into account is that this sort of failover can be only triggered like for once every 15 minutes. And I cannot trigger it again. With that, the recommendation we give for all the applications when you're developing is to build resilient connectivity. And that retrial logic is pretty much, there's a lot of documentation on it, which will show post this show. And there is also a very good sort of a GitHub repository that's been published by our product group. With that, I will hand over to Junchi, who will basically talk about cross-region failovers.
Awesome. Thanks, Adnan. So if you take a look at my screen on screen, the scenario I want to illustrate is basically migrating a workload from one region to another region using failover groups. So on screen, you can see within my resource group, I've got a web app deployed in Australia East, and a few databases deployed to Southeast Asia. And my objective here is to migrate these databases to Australia East for performance reasons. So one thing that you can see regarding my web app, it's a very simple web app. It's simply just a to-do list. So if I just create a new entry very quickly, entry. And then if I go to SSMS and just do a very quick query against the database, you can see that that record has been created. So how do I get started with failover groups? So within another resource group, I've created a logical SQL server, which I'm going to be failing over the databases to, as well as another elastic pool, which is basically necessary because I've got my single databases within that elastic pool. However, if you're just failing over single databases, you don't actually need this elastic pool itself. Prior to the creation of the failover group itself, you won't actually need to create these SQL databases. They'll be geo-replicated from your original primary databases when you create that failover group, and this will be notified to you upon the creation of that failover group itself. So how do I go about doing that? If I go into my SQL server, my primary SQL server, and then go into my data management settings, I can find the failover groups tab over here. I've already configured a failover group for the purposes of this demo, but I will create a new failover group just to show you the process. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is give the failover group a name, and this can be anything, so I'll just give that a random name. And then I'll specify a logical server that I've created prior to the creation of the failover group, or I can create it through the screen over here as well. So I'm going to specify the failover group I've already created. The third thing that I need to specify is a read-write failover policy. So do I want this failover group policy to be automatic or manual? So if this is an automatic failover group, upon a disaster scenario, the failover will commence. Or if this is more of a planned failover, I can specify that as a manual failover. If you do select the automatic failover policy, you also need to specify a read-write grace period. Essentially, this is the amount of time that we'll wait for before the failover will actually commence. So say, for example, if a disaster occurred, we'll wait 1 hour before the failover will already commence. And this is basically to ensure that, in the scenario where the outage, resolves itself within that time period, then there isn't anything to worry about. The final thing that you can do here is to configure the databases within that group that you can add to the failover group. So if I click that right now, I don't actually have any databases that can be added, and that's because I've already added those to the prior failover group I've already created. But what you would see in the screen is the number of databases within your primary server which you could add to failover. What you'll also see on screen here is the additional monthly cost that you will pay upon creation of the failover group. When you do create the failover group itself, Azure will automatically geo-replicate these databases to your secondary server, which results in those monthly costs. So for a migration scenario, this would be a temporary cost, as you would be deleting the original logical server as well as the databases alongside with that. But since I've already created a failover group, I'm not going to create anything here. I'm just going to go back to the failover group I've already created. So if I go into that failover group itself, what you'll see is that we get a nice visual showing my primary region, which is in Southeast Asia, and my secondary region that's within Australia East. Something else that's also provided, as Mo mentioned earlier, was a read-write listener endpoint. So this is very useful in the scenario where you're adding additional resiliency to your application, as whenever you use this endpoint instead, should a failover occur, you won't actually have to modify any connection string if you use this endpoint. So what I would do in this scenario is, if I go to my web app, if I go to the configuration settings and modify the connection string, which I will do very quickly, and use this read-write listener endpoint instead of my primary server endpoint over here. This will essentially ensure that should a disaster occur, I won't need to change my connection string to the secondary server endpoint should that event occur. So that's everything that's been set up. All I need to do now is to perform the failover itself. So if I click failover, you can see that that failover will take place. And this should just take a few seconds. So the length of time for this failover will depend on how many databases that you've got in your logical server, the size of the databases themselves. And it's important to note that when you are adding additional databases to your failover group, this will lead to longer failover times, either for a manual failover or an automatic failover. And it looks like that's completed successfully. So if I just go to back to my app and create a new entry, see if that's worked. So it's taking a bit of time. And testing the failover. Cool. So it's created that entry. And now let's just confirm with a quick select statement from our now primary server. So it looks like that's been failed over correctly. So within a migration scenario, your final steps here would be to just delete the resource group containing your original primary server. However, in this instance, I'm just going to keep everything the same. But that's everything that I wanted to showcase. So I'll pass it back to Simon.
Great, thanks, Junchi. That was a fantastic demo. I really love that listener endpoint, so that there's no need to modify connection strings once they are set up. That's an age-old issue for apps that are running against multiple upstream databases. I'm going to bring Mo and Adnan back on just quickly so we can wrap up this fantastic session. So there's Mo and there's Adnan. Folks, thanks a lot for coming on today. You know, as a developer, as I've said at the top of the show, we don't oftentimes think about how we can build resilience into our apps at a data store level. And the fact that we have, you know, a couple of really strong stories around cross-availability zone and cross-region failover is a really positive one, I think. And when we start to see things like those read-write listener endpoints that can mask the underlying complexity that, as a developer, we might have seen traditionally, I think we're really on a winning cricket pitch here. I think to take a sporting analogy into this live stream. So what we normally do is we just get everybody who's been talking on the show to quickly wave goodbye. So we'll say goodbye to the three of you folks. Thanks very much for joining us for today. So awesome stuff. Thanks a lot. All right. And let's wrap up. So as I said, we've just talked with Mohamed, Adnan and Junchi to look at how we can build resilient apps using Azure SQL Database. Our next episode will be next Thursday. We're going to have a debate, the age-old argument over tabs versus spaces. We're going to have two teams that are going to debate the value of whether you use tabs or spaces in your programs when you write them. So make sure that you check out that show. And then just a quick reminder, Microsoft Build is coming up at the end of May 25th to 27th. Registrations haven't opened just yet, but do keep an eye out for that. If you want to see the follow-on links and demos from today's session, you can find them on the debug log. If you follow that link on the bottom of the screen, those notes are now up on our GitHub repository, and you'll be able to find out how you can get in contact with Mo, Adnan, and Junchi if that's what you'd like to do. So thanks a lot for joining us for today's show, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Bye for now. you.